Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Australian Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Australia race ratings, the series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend, and also do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with the race result, and it's a very convincing win for Charles Leclerc as for the second time this year he picks up maximum points. Behind him then in second is Sergio Perez, and then the Mercedes pair led by George Russell in third, who picks up his first podium in that Mercedes seat. Looking down the list then, no Verstappen, no Sainz in the top 10, both drivers not finishing the race but for very different reasons, which we'll get into in just a minute. Also worth a note is Alex Albon in P10 picking up his and Williams' first points of the season. Now with the race itself, I'd generally say it was pretty decent, worth getting up for most definitely. Nowhere near the same action at the front that we've had in the past two, but still a good amount going down the field. Changes to the track look to have helped a bit, but I still say it's not the easiest track to pass on. Grade-wise, I think it's going to be a 6, maybe 6.5, but I'll stick with that 6. As I said, it's not quite on the level of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but was still entertaining enough to get itself a roughly average grade. On to teams, and I'll start with Haas, who are actually the team that finished last if you take the standings from just this race, which after the first two rounds, probably a little disappointing. With the drivers, I'll start with Magnussen, and he went for the alternate strategy to most of the field, starting on the hards, then switching to the mediums, and a race that almost ended up being very similar to Jeddah for him in terms of strategy, where he wanted to go long and was quite unlucky with the safety car just over 20 laps in. And even when he did pit under a VSC later on, came out in 17th and last, but managed to get back up to 14th. Did have quite the moment on lap 17 though, almost hitting the back of Tsunoda and then went flying across the grass at turn 9, which cost him some time and a place. Rating wise, I think it'll be a 5.5. Would have been a bit higher had he not had that little incident, as he generally did defend fairly well when he had to, and made up a couple places after he did stop. Moving to Schumacher, and a fairly quiet day really, pitted early from the mediums to the hards and was just sort of there in and around the likes of Zhou and Tsunoda, mainly sort of P16, P15 most of the time. I guess pace-wise was probably not quite there with Kevin, but did finish just ahead, so I'm going to end up giving him the same rating of 5.5. Neither had a great race, but I don't think they did too much wrong either, just I guess the car not being where they'd have hoped for the weekend. Next up, Aston Martin, and probably what has to be one of their worst weekends as a whole. So many incidents, a number of crashes, and after Williams picked up a point, they're now last in the standings. I'll start with Vettel in his first race back, and it really summed up his weekend, the way his race went. The notes I have are quite literally him going off at turn 11 on his own, and then losing the car on the curb and once again crashing on his own. So for a rating, I think it's going to be a 2. The reason it's not a 1.5 is just because when he was on the track, he looked slightly better than Stroll pace-wise, and considering how little time he'd had in the car over the weekend, it was never realistically going to be a great race for him. Then on to Lance Stroll, and considerably more to talk about. Started from basically the back after qualifying, and the team did make it interesting, pitting on consecutive laps to then try and take the hard tyres to the end, but then after Vettel's crash put another hard set on, which in fairness for a good portion of the race looked to be working alright as he defended generally really well. He kept the likes of Bottas and Gasly behind for 20 plus laps, albeit did get the 5-second penalty for weaving, which kind of made all the defending a little bit irrelevant, as even if he kept all 5 cars in the train behind, would still have ended up behind them. But with that said, did still manage to finish P12 in a car which has absolutely no business being there, so I think he'll get a 6. Would be a little higher had he not got that penalty, but ultimately he did so yeah, 6 for Stroll. On to Williams, and they'll for sure be really pleased to pick up a point. At the end of the day, it's a great result for them, and given where the car generally looks to be, a better result than what they could have expected. I'll start with Latifi, as it won't take too long. Managed to jump a few hard tyre runners at the start, given he was on mediums, but then after a few laps, once it settled down, he was down to the back, where he pretty comfortably spent most of the race, only getting ahead of Alonso at the end because of the Spaniard's extra pit stop. So rating-wise, probably a 3.5. Better than Jeddah, obviously, but still very comfortably beaten by his teammate and was just generally nowhere pace-wise. Talking of his teammate with Albon, for what I'd say at least for me, the driver of the season so far. Started on the hard tyres and very nearly finished on that same set, stopping on the penultimate lap only because he had to, and from there managed to just stay ahead of Zhou Guanyu to take a point. And remember, that's with a load of drivers around him stopping under safety cars or virtual safety cars, so to pick up P10 really to me is just an amazing drive. And throughout the race, his pace was really good. You know, he managed to hold off Ocon for basically the whole race, albeit he did have some issues. But I think rating-wise, it's probably going to be like a 9, actually 9.5. The only reason it's not a 10 is just simply because of Stroll holding up Zhou in that train of his, which probably helped Albon just to get P10. But generally, I'd say it was faultless. Pace-wise, tyre management, everything was done brilliantly. Next up, AlphaTauri, and in all honesty, they're probably just pleased to get both cars to the end of it, given how the first 2 races went. Strategy-wise, they did miss out, pitting both cars just before the safety car, and so maybe would have liked to come away from the weekend with a little bit more, had things gone their way. Starting with Gasly, and he really did suffer from that safety car, you know, and that first stint was in and around P8, P9 with the Alpines, and then after the safety car was stuck behind Stroll and Bottas for the best part of 30 laps. Did eventually get past, but then locked up and went deep into turn 13, allowing Bottas through, who he'd already overtaken, which would have cost him P8 in the end. I think rating-wise, it's probably a 6. He's picked up a couple points after an unfortunate strategy, which was good, but did get caught up behind Stroll and then made the mistake at the end, which hurts the rating a bit more. Then with Tsunoda, and for sure a worse race than Gasly, he did start pretty well and was ahead of Bottas after a good opening lap battle, but after all that, all I've really got for him, like Gasly, lost out with the safety car and then just didn't have the pace on the hard tyres. I think he finished something like 10 seconds back from Gasly in the end. So I think for Tsunoda, probably a 5, maybe 4.5, but not quite. I think that opening lap and first stint helps a bit, but he's still behind Gasly both in terms of finishing position and race pace. On to Alfa Romeo and a few more points for them, very nearly a double points finish, and I think overall they can be pleased. While they'd maybe like to be closer to the cars ahead, I don't think it would have made much difference to the end in terms of their total points haul. I'll start with Bottas. Like I mentioned with Tsunoda, had that opening lap battle but lost out initially, did make his way past a few laps later, but then like Gasly was a main part of that Lance Stroll train. Maybe if he'd got out of that much earlier, he could have been up towards Ocon, but that's probably likely the most he could have got. I guess he was passed by Stroll in sort of a borderline overtake as well, but still would have liked to have seen him make it back past a little easier. So I think rating-wise, it's probably going to be a 6, was generally good, but stuck behind Stroll a bit, and was handed P8 by Gasly locking up. Then with Zhou, a fairly quiet race, and missed out on a point in the end with Albon just coming out the pits ahead of him. The only real note I have is that he was behind Bottas for the majority of the race, even if he was part of the same Stroll train. So a little bit behind his teammate, sort of around 14th to 16th generally, and so I think it'll be a 5, not on the same level as Bottas, but still not horrendous, you know, like Latifi levels or anything. On to Alpine and sort of a weekend of what could have been after Alonso's crash in qualifying. Still a few points to take away though, so not a terrible result, but they probably would have liked to have got a little bit more from it. Starting with Ocon and a very quiet race, the only thing I have written down is the temperature issues which hindered him a bit behind Albon. He was kind of stuck behind him, but also given that Albon had to pit and there was space behind, it wasn't really worth fighting him. So I think for Ocon, it's probably going to be a 7, just an overall good, solid drive, even with a few issues to deal with. Though I do think had Alonso been up after qualifying and been on a better strategy, it may well not look as good as it ended up, but ultimately that wasn't the case. Then with Alonso, just sort of a race of gambles or strategy that didn't pay off, made some progress on his hard tyres, but was never ahead of Ocon without the pit stops and whatnot. And then onto the mediums later on, and just fell off a cliff as he had the front left graining, which ultimately meant he then had to stop again and finish behind Latifi as last of the finishers. He even managed to pit under the VSC and still couldn't really get anywhere. You know, compared to say a Magnussen, who also started on the hards and also pitted under a VSC, and he ended up 14th, having been running behind Alonso for most of it, I think it's probably going to be a 4 for Fernando. I know he wasn't helped by strategy, but to finish where he did after the potential the car had just isn't too great. Next, McLaren, and definitely a much more encouraging result for them, and at one point it did kind of look like they'd be challenging the Mercedes pair, but not really too much in the end. For the drivers, I'll start with Lando, but honestly, I'm pretty sure everything I say here will be the same for Ricciardo almost, as they were within maybe 2 seconds of each other for most of the race. I guess the main difference then was the starts, where Lando lost a few places to the Mercs and then couldn't get back past. I think overall though it was a generally good race, but they were comfortably behind Mercedes in the end, so I think it'll be a 7 for Lando. If he managed to have a go at Russell at some point when he was behind, then maybe it could have been a bit higher, but generally not too much to say for him. And then for Ricciardo, a very similar race, pitted the lap after Norris and followed him through on all the overtakes and crossed the line right behind him. Rating wise, I am going to give him a 7.5, and the reason it is just ahead of Lando is simply based off lap 1, where Lando lost a couple of places, he held position, so yeah, 7.5. Next up, Red Bull, and just frustration for them. Again, having car troubles which have cost them, 15 points for an extra third place? Plus they did look a bit off the pace of the Ferrari, so probably not too great of a feeling for them. I'll start with Verstappen, who never really had a realistic shot for the win, other than maybe when Leclerc gave him a chance at the safety car restart. For his race, was keeping up with Leclerc, and then a lock-up into 13 and front left graining just meant he dropped back, and by the pit stops was already like 9 seconds behind. Then afterwards on the hard, just couldn't keep the pace with Leclerc, and compared to previous races, wasn't as far ahead of Perez when he retired. So I think for Verstappen it's probably a 7.5. While obviously the DNF isn't his fault, I get the sense he probably overworked the tyres a bit and also wasn't majorly ahead of Perez like he has been in the past, but it still wasn't a bad drive or anything. Then on to Perez, and a race that's a bit tricky to judge. Lost a place on the first lap and did take a little bit of time to get past Hamilton. I think it wasn't until lap 10 he got through. And then at the end of the stint was overcut by Hamilton as he didn't quite get the best out of the tyres. Plus then after he did get back past, the safety car came out at just the right time to stop Hamilton getting back through. After that restart, it took him then roughly 10 laps or so, I think, to get past George Russell. So I think ratings-wise, it's probably going to be a 7, mostly because although he did finish P2, which is good, he was behind Verstappen and spent about 15 laps total just trying to overtake Mercedes cars, which, given where the Red Bull's at, to me just shouldn't be what he's spending his race doing. On to Ferrari, and another win, which I'm sure for them will feel great, but also only one car finishing, so could have been a bit better, especially when you take into account that only Red Bull finished as well. Driver-wise, I'll start with Sainz, and it really won't take too long. Lost a number of places at the start, a combination of changing the steering wheel last minute, which led to some wrong settings and the car going into anti-stall, as well as starting on the hards, which didn't help. But from there was just too ambitious to make it up straight away and ended up stuck in the gravel and out of the race on lap 2. So I think for Sainz, it's got to be a 1. I don't think it could have gone any worse for him really, and compared to Latifi getting 1.5 last time, this has to go down as a lower rating. Then at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, Charles Leclerc taking the win, and if I'm not mistaken, his first ever Grand Slam, so that's pole position, race win, led every lap and fastest lap. I think overall he did everything pretty much perfectly except for that second safety car restart, almost letting Verstappen through but managing to hold him off. With all that, for the third race running, it'll be a 9 for Leclerc, did virtually everything right and took the win by about 20 seconds in the end, so there's really not too much more to say on it. And then finally Mercedes, who after looking like they may have been behind even McLaren and Alpine through practice, managed to come away with the most points of anyone after the weekend. I think I'll start with Russell, and what was a very good race for him, got past Norris straight away and then settled in behind Hamilton. Did look to be dropping back a bit before getting quite lucky with the safety car, which obviously leapfrogged him up to third. From there though, put up a great defence on Perez and kept it behind for quite a while before the tyres were suffering too much. Then from there, not much until the end. So I'd say for Russell, he gets an 8. Would have to say I think it's his best race so far and best result, but did get lucky with the safety car, which stops me putting it any higher. And finally Hamilton, who I actually think had a slightly better race of the Mercedes pair. Like Russell, made moves at the start but gained 2 places rather than 1, and then in the first stint managed it really well, ultimately getting ahead of Perez on the track, and when the safety car came out was in the middle of the battle with Checo. I think from there he just sat back from Russell and Perez, and ultimately once Russell was ahead of him, with a combination of overheating, tyre wear and it being his teammate, he was never really going to go for a move, even though I do think over the course of the race his pace was just a bit better. So racing wise it's going to be an 8.5, just ahead of Russell because he was unlucky with the safety car, and potentially if that hadn't happened may well have been close with Perez at the end. You know, Russell only finished 3 seconds back anyway. So that rounds out the race ratings for Australia, maybe slightly lower ratings this time around, but it is becoming a bit easier to see how drivers are doing compared to their car. Anyway, as mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed, and subscribe for more F1 content along with leaving your thoughts, feedback and suggestions down in the comments below. Until next time, take care.